In this video I want to highlight what I think are the most important loci which focused the interwar art scene. Some are beginnings, others endings, all essential in telling the story of the time. Videos like this are often a little fruitless as they rely on simple narratives put together by historians, so I want you to consider these various factors almost as if they are musicians in an orchestra. Sometimes they're harmonised, sometimes they're ignored, but they're always at the disposal of the great composer, the artist. After Sargent. The Royal Academy of the Interwar must still be seen as the premier artistic ground for the three elite groups of Britain: the aristocracy, the merchant elite, and the so-called pillars of empire. During the Edwardian period, Sargent, with his masterful skill in capturing society women, created a frenzy for portraits of the great and the good. By the post-war period, Sargent was in old age, but the craze for portraiture of the elite was still very much there, with Orphan, the Knight family and Brockhurst all filling the roles of portrait masters. Gothic played out. Waterhouse, Dixie and Cooper were really the last of the true PRB-influenced artists, and with Waterhouse dying in 1917, it really marks the end of arts and crafts' power over the high art scene. More than that, historicism in general seems to be played out, with almost no reference to knights and the romances of the Gothic, and only a smattering of pieces dedicated to the classical. Manet and the Post-Impressionists. Roger Fry, the significant aesthetic thinker, painter and artistic pioneer, was well known but little accepted in the mainstream of British art. Through the 20th century he worked tirelessly to campaign for the adoption of the new art that was arriving from the continent. Focusing around French painting, he wished for Britain to adopt this exciting new way of thinking. His first major success was with his Post-Impression show in 1910 at the Grafton Galleries, where he wanted to showcase Manet and other French modern masters. With over 25,000 people visiting in a 2-month space, it had not only inspired a generation of new artists, but also made buyers and patrons consider this new form. Post-Impressionism is itself quite a nebulous term. If I was to try and pull together a list of features of this sometimes disparate work, I would say that the paintings in general had the following qualities. Naturalist subject matter. By naturalist I'm referring to the French school, which chose to focus on the lives of people rather than high-minded subject matters. We see this in Manet showcasing various depictions of scene life, or Van Gogh with the provincial, and most importantly, all of them return to nature. Vibrant colour palette. High value, clashing colours, tones that were taken from reality and are pushed to their extremes in a form of colour mannerism. Post-Impressionism places colour at its centre. Loose painting style. Little blending, sloppy brushstrokes, a low level of finishing on works. Most post-impression painting have been loosely painted. Graphic quality. While the painting style was loose, there still was a strong use of line in a Japanographic way. Shadows that would conventionally be painted with subtlety and blended smoothness are replaced with bold and powerful single lines. Anti-detail. Any form of academic or oriental detail is forsaken. The works are about the subject. Very little is painted in the background, and even then, only the ghosts and shadows of what is. A rejection of perspective. They fundamentally didn't care about traditional views on perspective and drawing, bending reality to their very will. The reduction of form. Complicated faces are reduced to lines and shapes. There is bulk to form, volumes projected in space. Fry's other important exhibition was the Nameless exhibition in 1920, which aimed to reconcile the various avant-garde painters in Britain, formed after the Post-Impressionist show, with certain Royal Academy members, by placing their works side by side anonymously. While a commercial failure, in my mind, having RA members work side by side with the so-called extreme modernists would undoubtedly have an impact artistically. Just how much of an impact Fry and his gang really had on the establishment art is fairly limited. As we go through this series, you will see that in general, many of the works have not adopted the extremes of the Post-Impressionists, although some of these ideas and techniques have permeated through. Sculptural modernism. In my mind, much of what we consider deco styling painting-wise does not come from the Impressionists, but as a reaction to the Cubist vein and a reflection on modern sculpture. Cubism, with its focus on animalistic primitivism and the reduction of reality into iconic forms, results in human bodies that are composed of jagged edges and strong lines. The most significant Cubist adjacent group is Wyndham Lewis's vorticists, operating in around 1916. People also forget the connection between Lewis and Fry via his employment in the Omega Workshop. How much impact this small band on the edges of artistic society has is again questionable. From a purely analytical point of view, there is not much to be said, with subject matter fixed in traditional genre and technical work, not looking to create these angular shapes, with the exception of certain artists like Stanley Spencer. Returning again to the so-called Deco style, we need to understand of it as a technical feature. It is the aim to represent surfaces in a smooth and consistent way. This gives objects and people a very unreal, almost unsettling feel, like we are looking at wax sculptures, not humans. The influence of the Exposition d'Art Décoratif, the so-called birth of Art Deco, in the world of British painting is overrated. In my opinion, the only potential influence on British artists may be Dupas, who featured heavily at that World Fair. But even he is operating in the mid-20s, long after someone like Morley has already exhibited in this style. So, where does it come from? I see a couple of potential strands. One of them maybe being an interpretation of the wave of early modernist sculpture, which really began 10 years earlier from 1905 to 1915. The smooth, textureless gradients were potentially taken from the sculptural forms of two of the early modern masters, Mestrovich and Bordel. Mestrovich, a Yugoslav who trained under Rodin, not only produced a significant number of modernist works early in the 20th century, way before the Cubists had managed to find anything of interest sculpturally, he also had a significant exhibition at the Vienna Museum that was very well received and seen. The impact of these modernist forms can be seen directly with sculptors like Reed Dick speaking directly in dialogue to Mestrovich's work, and indirectly with the smooth, powerful forms being reflected in the works of artists like Morley and Frampton. Bordel, another significant early modernist sculptor, had less coverage in Britain, but was exhibiting as part of the so-called International at the Grosvenor Gallery around this time. Although a modern, it's clear that his works were deeply rooted in both the medieval and the classical world, although of the rude sort, with an emphasis on power and strength over perfection of form. The final strand that might be a source of influence might in fact be from a return to historical works, especially during the late Renaissance period. There are a number of pieces that have this very smooth effect on the skin and surfaces. The best example in my mind is the masterwork from Jean Fouquet, his diptyque de Melum. The milky white, smooth skin looks very similar in style to someone like Meredith Frampton, and the woman herself would fit perfectly into one of his paintings if she were to don a contemporary dress. The New Woman. Women's suffrage arrived in England in 1918, and it marks a wave of confidence in cultural womanhood, as well as sexuality during this period. The Edwardian elite, painted by Sargent, often featured the provocative and rapacious daughters of the rich, and this mood continues into the interwar period, cascading down to the middle classes. The female nude is a popular subject even in this mainstream, something never seen when compared to the Academy of the 19th century. Is this a reflection of the power that women now have? A new sexual landscape for the elite class? Or simply the slatherings of a thirsty generation of playboys? Perhaps it's all three. Either way, this is undoubtedly a high of a great lunar age, and you can see the power that women have in the work. A return to landscape. Landscape paintings fade into the background of the mainstream after Turner's death, but as a subject it is undoubtedly revivified in importance towards the end of the 19th century, albeit through the edges of art. For example, returning to the post-impressionists again, Van Gogh and Matisse instantly spring to mind, but also we can look and see from other groups, such as Axeli Gallen-Kallela and Bocklin from the Symbolists. In the early 20th century, landscape once again gains standing. This has manifested itself in Britain with a series of waves of landscape painters. One immediately thinks of the Canadian Gang of Seven, although they were not frequent RA exhibitors, or the various Cornish painters. I think instantly of J. Olson or someone like Sidney Lee, who are at the forefront of this new landscape movement. The late Empire. While the artistic is paramount, we cannot forget the political. Was empire irrevocably damaged post-war? That question is too long and complex for this short video to look at. However, in my mind there is clearly a civil war in the ideas and directions of empire. It seems obvious that there is a hardcore of true believers in the original purpose of empire, a global peace and unified nation to facilitate the prosperity of the British people. You can see attempts at maintaining this status quo with the Empire exhibition in 1924 being held. This was in fact one of Britain's few world fairs, now purposely memory hold. But more importantly, the aesthetics and meaning are not that of an ossified and dying empire, but one looking to stretch out into the new century. Ever since the 1890s, there was a significant faction that wanted severe reform within empire. These middling reformers looked to create a more equal, Commonwealth-style model. This was clearly led by liberals, civil servant, and most importantly the media. If we wanted a crass analogy, we could compare it to the so-called deep state of today. The strength of this faction is most manifest in the attack on the 1926 painting Breakdown, which critiqued American influence on the West. The painting was lambasted by this class with many negative articles in the press, and with pressure from the Civil Service and Commonwealth Office, it was swiftly withdrawn from the RA gallery, showing the institutional and artistic power from this group of elites. The final group of extremists wished to totally dissolve empire and turn it into an American-style liberal democracy. This group was kept on the fringes of the intelligentsia, with the Fabians being the strongest organised manifestation of it. Ultimately, at this stage of time, they were culturally and socially at the outside, but they did have some cut through in the art world. After all of this, did Empire State really have an influence in the art world? Having reviewed all the art thoroughly, it's hard to say, but it does feel like the old guard are strongly represented, especially in the portraits of Orphan, while there are some more liberal views. Philpott's portraits of black men, some of the more loose paintings of women, are examples of this. Within the Academy, the status quo holds at this time. After the war, the interwar period is one of great moral and social reflection. Pessimism and optimism tightly combined. It is in fact a time of old and new. Many RA painters served in the war. Stanley Spencer, Orphan, Strang, Lavery, Augustus John to name a few, although the impact the war had on their work seemed to vary. For some, the war changed their very way of thinking. Wyndham Lewis and Nash immediately spring to mind, although both of them were at the fringes of art society at the time. For other artists, it became an opportunity. Orphan certainly would not have been knighted if it wasn't for his work as a war artist, and others got their opportunity painting during the war. Looking through the body of work, it seems that post-war optimism was more at play in the work. A new kind of freedom, especially from the preconceived morality, is prevalent. Ideas of dawn and the new dawn keep coming back time and time again. It is an attempt to write off the past as a fever dream and only look to the future. In fact, the singular critique of the war is in Orphan's original version of his Unknown Soldier painting, and I dare say he was only able to put that message in the work due to his closeness to the military and his war record. Let us come to an end of looking at the painting landscape and go into the various years themselves.